Well, hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this elective track hosted by HiBob on reinventing the organization. I'm Toby Huff, Director of People and Culture for HiBob Europe, and it's my real pleasure to be your host for our 90 minutes today. We're excited to bring you a top quality panel of speakers, ranging from a best-selling author, a C-level leader with fascinating experience, taking a genuinely different approach to leadership and the organization, and an HR leader well-versed in challenging the standard organizational structures that others can default to. So it's an honor to introduce our panel of thought leaders for the next hour and a half. Michele Zanini, the author of Humanocracy, Pat Caldwell, Chief Operating Officer at FundApps, and Victoria Bradford, Head of People Operations at Funding Circle. So a little bit about the order that we'll go in. Pat Caldwell will kick off our session with a case study on building a new type of organization for the future of work, followed by Michele Zanini sharing insights into his book, Humanocracy. And finally, we bring Victoria, Pat, and Michele all together for a panel discussion on the leadership revolution, with the main question, why do we need to radically rethink leadership and management in the new norm? During the panel discussion, we'll address some big questions, including what does leadership actually mean in these more modern organizations? What's expected from today's leaders, including HR leaders? What does the future of work or the new norm really mean in the broader sense? What needs to change, and what is the role of HR in this? What indicators can we use to know if we've been successful when adopting these bold new approaches to the organization and to leadership? After the panel, Will Smith, our sales engineer from HiBob, will run a quick 5-minute highlights demo of our HRIS platform, Bob. So enough on that, let's get started with our case study. And with that in mind, it's a real pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Pat Caldwell, Chief Operating Officer at FundApps, to the virtual stage. Pat is presenting a case study on building a new type of organization for the future of work. So without further ado, Pat, over to you.
Thank you very much, Toby. And thank you, HiBob, for having me along to talk a little bit more about FundApps, and hopefully everyone can see them. I guess by way of introduction, and thank you, Toby, for doing half of that for me. I'm the COO of a company called FundApps. Most people have never heard of us. I'll talk a little bit more about what we do. And I joined FundApps when we were 20-something people several years back to really focus on how we build and grow and scale an organization that aligns with the ambitions we had around the purpose of business generally. I think the key thing to keep in mind throughout any kind of case study, especially at a conference like this, is that everything I speak through about FundApps is something we've adopted for what we think is, I guess, a belief of ours or a way of operating within our business context. And none of this exists within a vacuum. And generally speaking, I'll talk at a little bit high level on our beliefs as a company, especially around the role of a business and some of the learnings we've had as we've grown. And then get into the detail for a few of these beliefs around how we've really tried to live that through our actions. One of the fascinating things about FundApps is the journey that we've been on. And it's a pretty non-traditional startup journey and something that we're quite proud of. First thing to know, if you've never heard of us, we are a B2B SaaS company. We deal within the investment compliance space. So our software solution is used by asset managers, pension funds, hedge funds, investment banks, sovereign wealth funds all over the world to manage their regulatory obligations that they have. Our journey is 11 years old and we're about 100 people, which doesn't usually fit the stereotypical startup type that you read about on the front page of magazines. We've never taken any funding. We've bootstrapped our entire journey, and we've led that through a belief that a really sustainable business model for us is finding a path to pay our own way, to keep our destiny within our own control, to iterate thoroughly and regularly, and to organically try and grow out this business to meet the potential that we have. As of today, we monitor $14 trillion of assets under management for our clients across the globe. We're 100 team members, as I said. We have our headquarters here in London. We have offices in Singapore and New York, and we have remote team members all throughout the EU. The final thing to know about FundApps, which is incredibly important when it comes to understanding how we approach this concept of a new type of organization, is that we're a certified B Corp. Now, it is certainly a more common term to hear throughout the US than it is throughout Europe, but I know it's growing in visibility. A certified B Corp comes down to what we believe is the purpose of our business. If I was to ask all of you now, let's say I'm a candidate in an interview going through your recruitment process, what's the purpose of your company? I'd be curious to know what the first thing is that you would say. There are many who would, I guess, resort back to a mission focus, which is, for us, for instance, we want to make compliance simple. It might be the more stereotypical startup feel of, we want to be the Uber of insert category here. It could be something a little bit more purist in the business sense, which is, we aim to turn a profit, we aim to deliver value to our shareholders. And these are things we've traditionally been taught as what we believe the purpose of a business to be. At FundApps, none of these are untrue. We're not a social enterprise. We are a profit-making company. We do believe that we want to make, and we do make compliance simple. But fundamentally, the purpose of our company is to do good. And this is buried within the culture and values that date right back to our founder setting us up 11 years ago. What we believe is the purpose of any organization in today's world is one that, yes, can focus on financial success, but can also focus on doing good in a few other areas. The highest level of accountability is when you hold an organization, the directors, the leadership team, every single person in the organization to account for the good that they do beyond just profit. We believe our role, and this is very much in line with B Corp's mantra, is that just as important as financial good is social good, environmental good, good within the community, and good governance and customer practices. And we try and live that through a lot of the things that we do. This influences a lot of the beliefs that we have too around how organizations grow and scale and what kind of changes we want to make as we grow and scale. And I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into how we think about things within a FundApps context. Again, I said at the start, we've built this and iterated on this for what we believe is the role of FundApps. Some of these obviously cross over into much more philosophical conversations. I'm sure we'll come to that with a few more presenters in the panel later on. But I wanted to give you that insight first to understand where we come from with how we've structured some of the things in our company. The first is that we don't believe that financial, social, and environmental good are mutually exclusive. There is this really strange myth within many cultures and many industries that if you're not focused on turning a profit, then you're probably a charity or a social enterprise. And the heart of every business is turning a profit. And sure, there is a sustainability piece that might exist within that. But what we want to build is a company that can be financially very successful, socially do an incredible amount of good, eliminate and do good in the environment, have great company governance practices that kind of live that value of transparency, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And we believe we can do all of them together. Are we perfect at it? Hell no. We make a lot of mistakes along the way. We iterate a lot of things. But fundamentally, our core principle is that as a certified B Corp, as a company that believes in doing better purpose, we hold ourselves to a triple bottom line. We even write the triple bottom line and that kind of mission lock, as B Corp would call it, within our company articles of association. Our directors, our leadership team are held accountable for delivering financial, social, and environmental good. The second belief that we have is a strange one. I do come out of a HR background. My role now obviously encompasses a few other different things. And we often look at what the business case is for something, and we try and really get at the heart of, what value is it going to bring? And one of the things we discovered as we were building out this organization and looking at how we do good is sometimes the best reason to do something is simply because it's the right thing to do. Does that mean we haven't been challenged on, okay, well, that's great, Pat. It's great that it's the right thing to do. Not everything is always going to be the right thing to do, but give me the ROI. Tell me what value it's actually going to deliver. And we've tried not to shy away from the fact that sometimes the things we need to unlearn as a business and implement are simply the right thing to do without a perfect quantitative business case. And we need to be comfortable with that. The third thing I imagine we'll have a little bit of discussion around it, which is the concept of hierarchy. Hierarchy has a bit of a dirty taste in people's mouths at the moment, and it has for a little while. And I think with good reason. The most common type of candidate who comes to talk to FundApps about becoming a FundApper is the person who's worked in a large organization. They talk about being a cog within a bigger machine, around not having an empowered role within the organization, about things like bureaucracy, slow pace of change, not being able to make decisions. And they're attracted to a small company. As a small and growing company, hierarchy is a fascinating thing. And it will be one of the examples I show around a concept of how we've restructured how we do a lot of our technical work to align to our strategy, not to people's professions or functions. So one of our beliefs is that hierarchy can become dreadfully bureaucratic if not used in the right setting. But we think there might be something in the middle where the value in some kind of hierarchy combined with a more flexible approach to org design can actually achieve some pretty cool outcomes. The fourth one is personal, because I have to do this regularly. Sometimes to grow, we need to unlearn. I'm going to share a little bit more about how we approach parental leave and hybrid work. Both are things where personally I've had to hold up a mirror and really get back to what's driving that decision from me. And if I didn't know all the things I'd learned from a mostly HR career, what would I do differently? And the final one is transparency, is the root of ownership. We default to transparency with pretty much everything. It means that every 6, soon to be 3 months, we stand up in front of the entire company and present every financial that we have, how much money that we've made, sometimes even if we've turned a loss that quarter. It means that we get access to every single document, every bit of information, knowledge that exists within our company. We give access to people within the company. And we do that on the basis that when you remove the asymmetry of information, you start ending up with a company of people who really act like owners. And it's a fascinating kind of cultural thing, which we'll touch on a bit in a moment. There is a sixth one, but the sixth one I'm going to present shortly in the context of a few of our initiatives. The sixth one is judge us by our actions. This is a commitment that we have to all FundAppers, which is there is too much that happens within companies these days that are based on good intentions and plans. And we need to stop holding companies, or perhaps in the context of environmental debates recently, even countries, to account simply on what they plan or intend to do at some point in the future. It's why we don't have a HR plan. It's why we don't have a diversity and inclusion plan. We believe that ultimately we should be held accountable for what we've done and the impact that we have, rather than what we plan to do. And we'll see how that plays out now when I lift the lid on a few more things that happen within FundApps. I'm going to pick and choose a couple of those beliefs and how we've played it through. The first one is the right thing to do, mostly because this is a fascinating one I imagine every HR professional comes up with all the time. When you know something's the right thing to do, it's really hard to get anyone on board with that. The first one is a gender pay gap. I'm well aware that there is a lot of research that talks to all the variables that can play a role within a gender pay gap. We don't believe any of those variables have led to a really disgusting gender pay gap that's grown at FundApps for, since we've been growing our company over the last 10 years. We don't believe any of those kind of excuses or rationales hold true for us. And we're happy to call out, and we have with our entire company, that until we get our gender pay gap to 0, it's not good enough. Over the last 4.5 years, we've been able to take it down from 36% to 5%. This is a perfect example of the fact it's not straight shooting the entire way, and things do change. We're obviously small, so things can change quite significantly. And we've made quite a few changes to how we think about our pay cycles, the market data that we use, how transparent with people we are around why their salary is set a certain way, and how we negotiate with people in the recruitment process. Still to date, if you were to talk to anybody at FundApps and ask them about our 5% pay gap, they wouldn't be celebrating that we've achieved a 31% drop. They'd be telling you it's not good enough. And we're going to keep going until it is 0%, because this isn't something to celebrate. It's something we fundamentally have to fix within many industries. This idea that it's fine to justify something that is broken systemically. It's the right thing to do to fix it. We also had an equal pay gap, a small one, but that's perhaps even more wrong than a gender pay gap. And since we've been able to make these changes and probably, again, hold us to account for actions, 50% of our people leaders are now women. That's up from 0% when this started. So you can probably see a few of the effects here. 50% of our promotions are also women. These are made from systemically coming back to the heart of holding up the mirror to a business, understanding where things might be broken, and iterating to make those changes. Everything from your performance review cycle, if you're doing performance reviews, through to how you set your pay frameworks, how you offer promotions, how you have those career conversations. The second one is something called a living wage, which I appreciate is very topical at the moment, especially in the context of across many different regions of the world, understanding what a minimum or living wage looks like, or even if we'll move towards some level of global minimum or living wage. One of the things we've thought about at FundApps actually came from a graduate that we hired a couple of years ago. I sat down with her and she spoke to me about stopping her pension contributions, which in the UK, you can opt out of pension contributions. I thought, okay, well, sure, we can absolutely do that. But why? What's led to somebody early in their career not wanting to make use of a matched pension scheme, not wanting to put money away from their retirement? And she said, actually, once you take into account the fact that I've got a student loan, I'm living in London, I am paying a lot of different expenses, I obviously want a social life, I'm trying to save money, it doesn't stack up at the end of every month. And I'm looking at what I can kind of control, I'm looking at things that may not be important to me now, and I'd like to stop my pension to free up a bit more cash for me to actually be able to cover my expenses, not go into debt. And it was a really humbling moment to hear firsthand from somebody who's just started their first role at a salary that is above living wage in London and well above minimum wage, for somebody that was struggling to make ends meet. And from a well-being angle, we came to a learning from this really, really quickly, is that any person's ability to grow and thrive is always going to be diluted without some sense of financial security. I'm sure there's a great Maslow hierarchy somewhere that will validate some of that, but it took us a little bit longer to get to that point. And we were thinking about how we actually go and address that. And we created something called a FundApps living wage. We said, okay, let's remove the legislation around minimum wage. Let's remove some of the great work that's happened even around living wages in some countries. We know we operate in a lot of large countries around the world. What would a living wage? What should a living wage be? And we decided to build our own. We said, let's start from backwards. For somebody to have that sense of financial security, it's not just that they can afford the expenses, they can go down to Tesco and buy their shopping, they can pay their electricity bill. True financial security also comes from having money to be able to travel and see family, having money to be able to have a social life. It comes from having enough money in your paycheck after all these deductions to be able to contribute to savings or an emergency fund. It also covers things like pensions and match contributions. The biggest impact you can make to your future financial security is in the early parts of your career. And we mapped it all out and said, when you take your pension and match contributions at the highest amount, when you put a reasonable amount inside of savings, social life, living expenses, rough rent if you're early in your career to share a flat within London, and map all that out and then reverse engineer it to cover tax, NI, and assuming someone has a student loan as well, how far off are we? And we were quite some way off. So we've now introduced something called a FundApps living wage. It means that we have a commitment in all the countries that we operate to not pay below our own living wage. It means that we do have graduates and people early in their career or people in roles that traditionally we've paid a little bit less, earning perhaps more than what you would expect in the market. But the feedback's been fundamental, because that financial security early in their career means that we know firsthand that we have so many more people who are making use of match contributions and pensions, who have that level of financial security, even taking up some of our other benefits to look at things like financial wellness and go to planning clinics. The second item is around hierarchy. I'm going to whip through this one because the next slide is perhaps more potent. I spoke before a little bit around maybe the pros and cons and where it might play a part. Any small, I call it a scrappy startup because it's relevant obviously for us, but this could also be an early team formation too. It generally tends to look something like this. You've got a bunch of people in a room, or even virtually now, who are all doing something slightly different, and it works. They're talking to each other. They have some pretty fluid responsibilities. And anyone who's worked in a really early stage startup, despite the chaos, there is an efficiency that comes with it. And we think that comes a lot down to the structure and design that's been built within those small teams and scrappy startups. But when startups grow, maybe they've got a round of funding, maybe they have signed a few new clients or grown their customer base, and they start adding more people to support that increase in workload or cater that future demand. It starts to look more like this. We end up with more and more people, and we start to get some of the stresses that happen within communication because the group becomes too large. You also start to see some of the roles specialize a tiny bit more. The person who might have been doing a little bit of sales, a little bit of customer success, maybe a little bit of product management on the side, starts to have a role that focuses a little bit more functionally. And as we keep growing, we realize every intent of having this perfectly flat organization goes out the window, and we end up with something that looks like this, obviously grossly simplified. We default to what we know and what we're taught and what 98% of companies around the world have in place. And we even do in some of our teams still have this in place. And it's a mostly functional hierarchy. Now you can imagine what happened, the efficiency that used to exist within the scrappy startup from people talking to themselves, having a bit more fluid structure, self-organizing their work, starts to change. Because if you're one of those blue outlined circles, instead of talking directly to the square, you're almost incentivized by design to have to talk up the chain. You start talking to your manager, and your manager might talk to their manager, and their manager talks to them. Multiply that by so many teams and so many people, time differences, asynchronous communication around the world, and you end up with something that feels kind of slow and kind of bureaucratic, but it is very controlling. And it provides a sense of calm and stability because everything is structured perfectly. The teams are always managed and they're defined by function. We used to have this within our engineering product design teams. And we started realizing that as we kept growing, as we doubled, tripled the size of the team, more work was getting done. But the cycles we were operating actually tended to last a little bit longer than what we thought. Our releases were taking a bit longer, communication was strained, a little bit more conflict, people making some assumptions around other people's intent. And we said there's obviously a cultural piece to this, but perhaps there's a design piece as well. We experimented with a concept called product teams. I appreciate the irony in that I'm about to not talk through exactly what a product team is, even though we've decided to call it that. But we decided to run a fluid org structure. This covers our front end, back end, DevOps and infrastructure, designers, products, and even some of our sales team when we need as well. And we decided to organize these teams by our strategy, not by their profession or their kind of functional group that we traditionally have, the old department. We boxed this within a few different things to create that space where we think it might work. First one was a 6-week appetite and a 2-week cooldown. This simply means that we will allocate, or the teams will self-organize their work within a 6-week cycle of work before having 2 weeks to be able to go back and then re-look at the work that they've done, think about things that might be able to improve. A team that's self-sufficient, so teams that are small enough to build ownership, but big enough to be self-sufficient, big enough to have the right skills within their team that they need to cover. All of our teams are allowed to organize their work with whatever methodology they choose, whatever cadence that they choose as well within that, and to solve problems the way that they want to solve them. And an ownership mentality, which is if you build it, you run it. So if you are in a team, take prod team 3 here, and it might not just refer to a product. Some of these refer to a different vertical that we're playing with at the moment that may not even have a product. But if you build something, you run it. And if it breaks, you're accountable for fixing it. It's a really, really great turn of how we then focus on the outcomes rather than throwing work over the fence, which happens in a lot of big teams. These team structures change quite regularly. And they change based on people's interests, based on their skill sets, based on what we need to achieve with our strategy. So prod team 3 here is literally the example of one of our teams that we have in our current cycle. I've obviously just swapped out a few names of things, but we have a team lead, which in this case is actually one of our junior developers. It's not the manager of the team leading this team. It's a developer who has a particular passion for this idea to explore, and we have resource behind it. It has a product owner, has a front end, a back, or actually in this case, 4 back ends and 1 DevOps. This team will be together for 6 weeks. They'll have a 2-week cooldown at the end of it, and then we'll revisit what the product roadmap looks like, the things that have come out of this recent cycle before reshifting our teams to focus on what we want to do for the next 8-week cycle. The final bit before I wrap up is a concept of unlearning. And I mentioned this was a personal item for me, knowing how often I have to do this from some of the things I was taught early in my career. And I want to talk about parental leave and hybrid work, and I imagine we might come back to one or more of these concepts a little bit later on. We've learned that parental leave is mostly built upon concepts that if we'd had our time again, we may not have done it the same. The idea that we have maternity leave, paternity leave, adoption leave, shared care leave for anyone in the UK, we're still trying to work out what that means. And all these different policies written multiple pages, and it works for everyone except for parents, which is fundamentally flawed. We also have regional differences. When we talk about parental leave in the UK or in Denmark, in Germany, and Singapore, it's very different to when we talk about parental leave in the US. It's met with a different reaction. We had to unlearn what parental leave looks like. We actually threw out about 20 pages of policy. We asked our parents to design it for us. We simply said, don't look at the legislation. Don't look at everything you know. Think about your experience as a parent. What does parental leave need to look like for you? And they came back with something that's about half a page. I've obviously simplified here into a couple of bullet points. They said, realistically, a meaningful amount of time that's still practical for a business, 6 months full pay, nothing less. It's gender blind. No one in our group of parents came up with a separation between maternity and paternity leave. Completely gender blind. It's available global. And the perfect statement behind this was that regional differences are not a reason to lower the bar. So if a country is maybe not quite up to where other countries are in terms of their statutory regulations, that's not a reason to lower it. So we make it global. We cover every family circumstance. We cover stillbirth and one of those things you hope you never have to use. We removed a tenure requirement because nothing says we don't trust you to a new team member than saying, here's your pay. We expect you to work really, really well at the start. You have access to all your benefits except for parental leave, which if you didn't trust them to use parental leave, I'm unsure why we trusted in the first place to hire them. And 2-year flexibility, because in the early years, I'm not a parent, but I think one of the most common things that came from our parents at FundApps was the first 2 years is particularly hard, especially if it's your firstborn. So having that flexibility to use that leave was important. And the final bit is our lovely favorite friend called hybrid working. We had a once in a generation, perhaps even less often opportunity to be able to redefine what flexible and hybrid working actually means. We put everyone home. We made it work for people who obviously could work from home. We got home working correct. We started to explore this concept of psychological well-being a little bit better, concepts of loneliness. It brought out accessibility issues and inclusion issues that maybe didn't have enough face time before. And then as we got towards the end of the pandemic, we ended up with so many companies saying, we've been able to make this work. We're super flexible and we're really excited to support the next generation of flexible working. We'd like you to come to the office 3 days a week and you can spend 2 days at home. There is absolutely nothing flexible about that, nor is it really hybrid working in a way. We did the same approach around unlearning. And we didn't get here first go. We took a few iterations of this. And what we believe is the future of work is choice. Choice to be able to work to your personal circumstances, and for businesses to focus on outcomes, not on time or effort or presenteeism. And when we had that as our fundamental principle, what we came up with was not 3 days a week in the office. It wasn't even fully remote, actually, because we had feedback from people, which was, I don't want to work at home. Nor was it fully in the office. We didn't run that argument behind why water cooler conversations are so perfect. Instead, we simply said, make it work. And this is a copy and paste of our current hybrid working statement to people, which is available from day one. Make it work for you. Choose an arrangement that's going to work. 5 days in the office, 5 days at home, anything in between. And we've had that in place now since obviously regional restrictions have allowed people to be able to return. I'm currently in the office today, despite my lovely loft background. And we trust people to make the decision. And perhaps the learning out of this one is that our trust in people wasn't misplaced. Our trust in people actually led to a genuinely meaningful approach to hybrid working that suits people's personal circumstance, that's kept people wanting to work for us. We've had very little attrition over the last 18 months, and we're having an impact on people's lives with this. It just so happens that by doing that, we're not losing anything as a business. If anything, we're gaining it, but we haven't seen that detrimental thing that so many articles are talking about now, which is, you need to have that perfect balance. We don't believe there's a perfect balance. We believe that's up for people to decide. Really appreciated you having me on board to hear a little bit more about FundApps. I'll obviously be in the panel and part of that. And if you wanted to know anything else about FundApps, feel free to reach out afterwards. Otherwise, I will pass over the stage, so to speak, back to Toby.
Thank you so much. And I think I speak for all of our attendees when I say that we're very glad that you'll be with us on the panel after having shared so much there. A real highlight for me was this concept of unlearning. I think as HR leaders, we are often in positions where we need to rely on past experience, and we need to deal with things often very quickly and under time pressure. And the default is just to rely on that past experience to answer a question quickly and move on. And actually this idea of using that experience to test ourselves as to when we should be challenging the truth in the experience and rethinking, rather than simply saying, I know the answer, here it is. With your beautifully illustrated example, say a parental leave, is just so poignant. It's really, really resonated. And I love this idea as well of your example of the simplicity in some of the solutions and speaking to your team before you understand what some of those answers should be. That example around your living wage was really poignant. We asked people to come to show them, we bring their whole selves to work, and yet if bringing their whole selves to work means really hearing their vulnerabilities and their concerns, but not being willing to support them in their whole selves, then we're letting our people down. And that was a learning for me as well. So thank you, Pat, and we'll see you later on. So next, I'm really pleased to introduce Michele Zanini, the author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, Humanocracy. Michele, it's such a treat to have you with us to discuss your book and share your highlights with us. So look, I'm just going to pass over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Toby. And thank you, Hi Bob, for helping make the session happen, and Michele and the HR Congress, and to Pat too, who had an amazing presentation. I'll definitely come back to some of the things he said because they're so thought-provoking and in line with my thinking as well. So I'm really, very grateful to be here with you and really talk about how to build organizations that are fit for the future, but also fit for human beings inside of them, right? Because as Toby and Pat so thoughtfully talked about, at the end of the day, that's how competitive advantage is built, right? Through people and unleashing their full potential. Let me just go through. I already gave you a little bit of a preamble, so let's go through the agenda. So I have about half an hour. I'll try to move smartly through 4 points that we are, covering in much greater detail in a book that Gary Hamel and I co-authored recently called Humanocracy. The first thing I want to argue is that we need a radical change in how we think about organizing, leading, and managing. Second, provide some examples of organizations that have done this by abandoning traditional models of organization and to really have done this at large scale with tens of thousands of people. Third, while it's great to talk about practices and learning from companies that have kind of operated differently, I want to emphasize the importance of principles or a new management DNA in a way that we need to inject in our organizations. And given that many of you are in people-related roles and functions, I want to close with a bit of a provocation and a message, I think, a hopeful message as well, not just a rant, around the role that HR can play in bringing about truly human-centric organizations. So, as I said, a lot of ground to cover. So let's get going here. And let me just start with a question for you. What kind of organization do you dream of, right? As HR professionals, as people professionals in organizations, how would you finish the sentence? And think about that for a moment or two, okay? And as you do that, let me share, the dream, that drives me and Gary as well, right? And it prompts us to really focus on this issue. We dream of organizations that are truly resilient, that they can intercept the future, that where people can take initiative and they feel like they're running their own business, even if it's inside of a large firm, where the company can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time, as they say in the US, that is, they can be creative and disciplined at the same time, and where everyone's potential is unleashed and everybody feels like they matter, they're worth something, and they're treated fairly and respected for who they are. And the problem is that many organizations these days are not like this at all. Over the last few decades, Gary and I have developed this conviction that large established organizations are just not as capable as they should and frankly ought to be. And whatever the country, whatever the sector, it seems to us that large organizations always stumbled against a core incompetence, and that the root of this incompetence really had not much to do with the business model or the operating model and so on, but rather the management model, the management operating system that really runs the gears of these organizations. And perhaps the most apparent of these incompetencies is that most organizations, especially established ones, struggle to intercept the future, right? And to be truly creative, and the corporate inertia that characterizes many of them it has to do with the fact that they're just not very good at introducing new business models and enabling innovation to come from within the company. And typically innovations in the industry come from young companies which don't have to deal with the machinery of bureaucracy. And industry incumbents are famously slow, right, to respond to new challenges and opportunities. And to the point where, like, we now, it's not a surprise. We expect the newcomers to beat the old timers, right? And we see this time and time again across multiple sectors and geographies. Now, you might think that this is kind of an inevitable feature of creative destruction. You can't, after all, you can't expect the incumbents to spot every single opportunity and preempt every single competitor that is just that starts up, and that's true certainly in some cases, but often companies fail to intercept the future, not because it's somehow unknowable and no one could have expected something to happen, but rather because it's unpalatable, and people, especially those at the top of these organizations, just don't want to deal with it and address it in a proactive way. Let me give you an example. All the major automotive groups now in the world have decided to go big on electric vehicles, EVs, right? And they've announced recently this year billions of dollars in investments and very ambitious sales targets for the 2020s and beyond. And this is a welcome development for all of us, right, who care about the planet. But it strikes me that these companies have gotten to this point at least 10 years late, if not more. And this is, again, not because of a technical issue or some sort of unforeseen circumstance. It's just sloth and inertia that just makes these companies move incredibly slowly. Right? So let me just say a little bit about this and show you a couple of trends, right? The first is around the steady decline of battery costs. They've been dropping precipitously over the last 2 decades, going from about several $1,000s per kilowatt hour to now a couple hundreds in recent years. And this is a line that has been there for people to see and watch and extrapolate where things were going to go, right? The second line is around the steady rise of CO2 emissions, right? And the fact that, again, this is like quite apparent. And by the way, automakers have been aware of the impact that fossil fuels have on climate change and the impact that cars have on that since the 1970s. So the implications of this trend haven't been a mystery, right? And when you put these together, what you get is a point where, like, it's not that these two lines are really crossing in any meaningful way, but you get to the point where in the early 2000s, it starts to become apparent to people like Elon Musk that maybe there should be a market for electric vehicles, right? That capitalizes on the decline of batteries and the increase in CO2 emissions. And that, Tesla was established in 2003. Their first mass production car, the Model S, came out in the early 2010s. And now it's a car company worth $1 trillion, many multiples of all the other automotive makers put together. Now you might quibble, maybe Tesla's not worth $1 trillion, but it's certainly worth more than all these other car companies that just totally missed the future and decided to ignore what was pretty obvious, right? And maybe they'll catch up. I hope they will, but it's not a foregone conclusion. I mean, think about the fact that in September, the best-selling car in Europe was the Model 3 of Tesla, not just EVs, just the best-selling car in Europe, more than the Renault Clio and other kind of traditional cars. So anyway, and we see this again and again. I could show you similar charts for the cable companies ignoring streaming and Netflix. The high-tech companies missing the mobile revolution, and and as I said before, a lot of this has to do with companies just deciding to ignore the trends. Or ignoring it first, dismissing it, then dismissing its implications, and this is a problem of kind of how decision making happens in organizations. A lot of it is concentrated at the top. So as long as those executives are unwilling to kind of write off their rapidly depreciating intellectual capital, the companies are held hostage. And there may be people inside those companies that want to change things and move much faster, but they're just stifled from doing that. And this is, it has a huge cost to the companies, but then, as I said, to us as stakeholders more broadly. The other big incompetence I wanted to mention quickly is just the inhumanity of a lot of organizations that are out there today. And it's kind of a bold thing to say that they're inhuman, but what we really mean here is that they just waste probably as much human capacity as they use. And a lot of data really shows that people are just not bringing their best selves to work, right? You might have seen this data from Gallup before. They measure employee engagement across the world, and they report that 15% of employees are fully engaged, right? Which means 85% are not bringing their ingenuity, their creativity, their passion to work every day. And Europe, it doesn't fare better. Actually, fares worse in terms of the people that are highly engaged, only 10%. And this is why it matters. And Pat mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Well, this is a slightly different hierarchy, but it kind of gets to the same point. I think we think this is a hierarchy of work-related capabilities, right? And at the bottom, you have obedience. Every organization needs people that follow basic rules around safety, financial discipline, customer care, right? Obviously. Next, you have diligence. You want people who are willing to work hard, right, and take responsibility for results. Of course. The third level is expertise. To be effective in your job, you need to have the requisite skills to do it properly. Now, these capabilities are really important. They're essential in a way, but they seldom create unique value. They're commodity capabilities, right? Winning in the kind of economy we live in today, the creative economy, requires more, right? You need people who have initiative, who are self-starters, or proactive, right? Who don't wait to be asked. You need people who are creative, who are able to reframe problems and generate new ideas and solutions. And finally, you need people who are really passionate for what they do, that they're willing to stretch themselves and take risks for a worthy cause. And these things, creativity, initiative, and valor, you can't command those, right? Those are gifts that employees decide to bring or not to organizations, right? And as the Gallup data suggests, the answer is usually no, and sometimes it's hell no. And a key reason for this lack of engagement is lack of agency. Employees that really don't have a lot of autonomy to exercise initiative. And I'll just show you some pretty depressing numbers taken from a number of large-scale workplace surveys in the U.S. Right. So 1 in 5 employees strongly believes their opinions count at work. 1 in 10 feels like they're empowered to change things to improve the work experience. Less than 1 in 10 is free to take risks to improve product and services. And and despite the hype about renewed focus on people at work, these numbers really haven't changed that much for the last few decades. And certainly some of these numbers are fresh from the pandemic. They certainly haven't improved during the pandemic. Now, these are American numbers. You might think that Europe is a little bit better. I don't actually think it is. I mean, this is data taken from 20,000 establishments in Europe. And as you can see, the number of companies in which employees are able to manage their own tasks, identify new problems, and continue to learn is tiny, right? Less than 20%. And, and even worse, and this is the worst thing for me, is that basically a quarter of managers believe that involving employees in changing and improving the organization creates competitive advantage. I mean, just think about that. That's just, to me, it's incredible. Now, I wanted to show you some data because break down the point. I had a point there about the number of people that feel like their opinions count at work, and that was about 21% for the overall average. That picture hides the fact that there's quite a bit of discrepancy, and a lot of jobs that have been especially hit hard during the pandemic in hospitality, personal care, in production context and transportation, they have even worse scores than the average. I mean, the average is bad enough, but when you get into a production context, 1 in 10 feel their opinions seem to count at work, not even count at work, they seem to count. That's just really depressing. And just by comparisons, managers fare much better, but still, even for managers, 40% is not much to write home about in terms of the number of people who feel like their voice counts, especially given all the hype and I think right focus on, I would say, on things like psychological safety, but it doesn't seem to be making much of a dent still. And you might have heard a lot about the Great Resignation. It's no accident that the occupations in which people are quitting in droves in the US are occupations where they don't have a voice, where probably compensation is terrible, where they don't have control over work hours. I mean, it's not an accident, and despite what you hear on LinkedIn, the white collar Zoom class, and some of whom are part of this call, myself included, we are not really, displaying the same kind of trend. Like the world has become separated in terms of the world of work, in terms of outcomes. And, the fact of the matter is most people work in sorry, I don't know what happened there. Work in non-professional occupations. So it's millions of people whose work conditions have deteriorated. I wanted to show you this just as a quick indicator of how people are getting fed up. This, I don't know if you're familiar with Reddit, but it's this website where there are different channels and you post interesting content or questions and discussions. One of these channels is called Anti-Work. And it's dedicated to people like typically seeking help to deal with workplace issues. Some of them are actually thinking about quitting work altogether, but most people are trying to fix problems that they're encountering. And and the number of people that are members of this subreddit has gone up to 1 million people. It was about 10,000 before the pandemic. And if you just visit this website, I'd encourage you to see it. Just get a reality check. You just see scores of posts about people dealing with anxiety, tyrannical bosses, the grind of living paycheck to paycheck, and kind of strategies for reclaiming time for a job. I mean, this is like a signal, right? That something is deeply broken and people are just having enough. And, and people are just not putting up with the fact that we do have this caste system in most organizations where you have the thinkers at the top and the doers at the bottom, right? And where you're just basically asking people to put their brain on ice and not really think for themselves. And, none of it's okay. And in our book and our work, we're trying to change this, but it shouldn't be surprising either, right? Most of our organizations are bureaucratic at their core. I mean, if you think about the features of bureaucracy sounds like an old-fashioned term, and like horsepower, in many ways it is. But if you look at the features of bureaucratic organizations, as we list them here on the slide, and ask yourself, how many of these apply to my organization? My bet is like most of them actually do, if not all of them, right? And that's a problem, because bureaucracy might have made sense 100 years ago, when the fundamental challenge was to employ a bunch of illiterate workers, right? To churn out products at scale, but we live in a completely different environment. And, we need organizations that are able to be efficient, but at the same time are also adaptable or innovative. And, you may or may not like the term, but we wanted to differentiate it for something that is different from the dominant bureaucratic paradigm, and where the focus isn't so much on control, but rather or compliance, but rather contribution. Now, you might think, well, this is kind of all interesting, but like bureaucracy stinks, but opposed to what? Is there an alternative? And thankfully, the answer is yes. We've been studying over our last several decades a number of organizations that are able to take the benefits of bureaucracy, the conformance, the discipline, the reliability without the kind of the tax, the bureaucratic burden that comes with the traditional way of organizing. And I'll just give you very, very quickly a couple of postcards from this kind of vanguard. One is Hire. They're the largest appliance maker in the world. We've been studying Hire for over a decade, and they have about 84,000 employees. They're based in Qingdao, China, but they have operations all over the world. And they've been driven by a CEO, Zhang Rumin, who's recently retired, who basically wanted to show the world and himself and his employees that it's possible to create an organization that can be as entrepreneurial as a startup, while at the same time being really large. And it really started from this idea that people have inherent worth, and they need to find an opportunity at the workplace to fulfill their potential. Now, we've detailed Hire's practices in a chapter of a book and an article in Harvard Business Review. There's a lot to unpack because it's such a radical model, but let me just kind of quickly touch on a few. The first thing about Hire that is interesting is that, especially because they're like a really large company, is the degree of disaggregation. So their operations are broken into thousands of independent microenterprises, or MEs. Some are market-facing units, like some unit that is focused on bringing to market 3-door refrigerators, are doing supply and service jobs. Others provide R&D, manufacturing, and the like. And these MEs are linked together through an internal market where they buy and sell services from each other. So for instance, a product microenterprise will contract for design services or even HR help. And distribution access from different MEs. And these contracts then have performance clauses so that everyone's compensation is tied to marketplace outcomes. So if a product that you as an HR team is helping support through the work of a particular enterprise, right, that you're supporting, if that product doesn't do well, you as an HR team will take a hit. And this ties everyone pay to the value that is created for the customer, and aligns everyone to one common cause, right? And it makes the haggling that you might think would impair coordination in this kind of contractual system not be a relevant concern. And critically, there are no internal monopolies. Bad feedback from its internal customers, and other microenterprises won't use them. And so, it just keeps everybody incredibly honest on delivering the best they can deliver, whether the customer is inside or outside the firm. And the other mind-flipping thing about Hire is that leadership of these microenterprises is a competitive affair. So you get to bid when a new enterprise is formed about leading that team. And if leaders lose the confidence of team members, they're voted off the island, literally. So they're deeply accountable to the team for results. So it's an amazing example. I'm just going to fly through. You probably have heard of Bertserg before. I'm going to fly through this. But I wanted to mention one thing that I think is relevant for the conversation, and kind of alludes to something that ties back to something that Pat said earlier. So Bertserg is the leading Dutch provider of whole health services, of about 16,000 care workers, and they're organized in 900 self-managing teams. And they operate a little bit like the Hire teams, although they're taking care of people. They're not making toasters or washing machines. And they have all the dedicated territory that they are focused on, and they manage in a truly autonomous way all sorts of tasks, whether it's treasury, performance management, planning, performance improvement, developing people, and they're all trained on how to do this in a self-managed way. And the company basically has these 16,000 people working 900 teams, and they all kind of report to two people. So there's basically no layer between the founder and the other director of the company. The founder is Jos de Blok, and the teams themselves. There are some coaches who help them out, and there is an IT, HR, finance, typically accounting staff, but it's very, very small. So what they've done is they've syndicated the work of managing to all these teams, and they've preserved that spirit of entrepreneurship by essentially disaggregating and making sure each team can operate in that way, in a very efficient way. And efficient, they really are. Their costs are much lower than the industry average, and patient satisfaction is higher. Staff turnover is much lower. So it's an amazing success story that goes against any kind of standard you might think would need to be in place in healthcare to guarantee those kinds of outcomes. So when you look at these companies and others beyond, you get a glimpse of what's possible, like what kind of organization can enable people to give their very best, and what kind of practices need to be in place for that to happen. And this is a short list of some of the hallmarks. But one of the things that I wanted to mention is that what connects these vanguard companies together is not so much what they do in the specific, but rather how they think more broadly, right? So let me just say a couple of things about this, because as we study these organizations, we just asked ourselves again and again, like, how did they end up with these kinds of crazy practices, right? And what we discovered is that all of them embrace some very deep principles, deep ways of thinking that are very unconventional in the corporate world. First, they focused on solving a different problem. Like, unlike traditionally managed companies, which really focus on the compliance piece, right? They really started with a different point. Like, we want to unleash human potential. We want to maximize contribution, right? And with that focus, then you're pushed to develop a new set of management principles. So instead of the bureaucratic principles around stratification, adding layers, right? Specialization, just giving people, very narrow jobs and so on. They've embraced values like markets, like openness, like ownership, and so on. And with those principles in mind, they've invented and adopted a new set of practices that are consistent with those principles, right? And in so doing, they've just found a new way to boost performance. And I should say, for each of these principles, we have a whole book in the chapter, and I don't have time to unpack them, unfortunately. Although I am tomorrow. I have a master class, just shameless plug, 11:15 a.m. CET, I think, where I will talk about how you do this, how you take these principles and drive them into the management model of the organization. But the question still remains, and I want to kind of get to this: how do you embed these principles into management practices? So what these companies have done is they've thought very systematically about the different elements of the management model, the various processes around planning, HR, finance, and so on, as well as the architectural elements that provide the scaffolding for those processes, like structure and task designs and the information backbone and so on. And they've thought about changing, reimagining each of these features of the management model in light of those principles. So, for instance, let me give you an example. Markets is one of the principles we talk about in the book, and markets provide all sorts of advantages around allocating resources very quickly, as well as leveraging the collective intelligence of a dispersed group of people. So what these companies have done, and not all of them have kind of measured in principle, in markets as a principle, but they've taken seriously these principles, and they thought, like, how do we rethink how performance review happens, or how budgeting happens, and so on. So in the case of markets, I'll just give you some quick examples. So they, created, this is what Hire has done, and many others. They've created internal markets where you could choose your provider, where you're contracting with each other, where you are creating new ways of doing planning and forecasting. I don't know if you're familiar with prediction markets, but they're essentially markets where the parties take different sides of a bet about a future event. For instance, will the sales of our product reach a particular level? And what they find is when you kind of create those prediction markets, that the crowd is much more precise and accurate about the future than your finance staff or whoever is doing planning and forecasting in your organization. So they've reimagined planning to harvest the collective intelligence of several people. They've created a model of resource allocation that is more like Silicon Valley than the Soviet Union, where you have multiple sources of capital. So if someone says no, like your boss says no to your idea, you might be able to go somewhere else and get a second hearing. And of course, and this is a topic that is often talked about in HR, but they've created true markets for talent, where people can frictionlessly go from opportunity to opportunity based on a fit between where the company needs them and their desire. So these are some of the ideas that are generated when you think deeply about these principles and you overlay them with the management model. And in the last few minutes I have, I wanted to close with a few thoughts on the role of HR in accelerating the evolution of organizations so that they become more human-centric and capable. Now, HR, the good news is that HR has actually done pretty well over the last 20 years. If one looks at budgets and if one looks at headcount, this is data from the US. People in HR occupations, there are about 1.5 million people in the United States working in HR. 25% of them are managers, I think. they've grown far faster, much more rapidly than the overall workforce. And budgets have reflected that as well. The question is, has HR's influence increased by the same amount, right? And I'd be curious to get your take. But if you look at surveys like this one that IBM did with a number of hundreds of CEOs around the world, the results aren't very promising, very good for HR. In this particular survey, only 60% of CEOs thought that the CHRO is the most crucial role in the C-suite, their go-to person, right? That's 3.5 times less than the CFO. And given that HR should be the advocate for people in organizations, this is not good news, right? For those of us who want to build human-centric organizations. But part of the problem is that the lack of relevance is it has to do with the fact that processes that are either run by HR or heavily influenced by HR are largely viewed as ineffective. So some of the least liked processes in organizations are people processes. I mean, just take the example of performance management. I'll just kind of do a very quick dive into this. But every so often you get an article appearing in HBR or Fortune saying that, the future of the performance review is here. We're about to change everything, and we're going to bring performance management to the 21st century, right? But the fact of the matter is, we're still stuck with a traditional process that very few people are happy with, right? And the body of evidence suggests that traditional performance review processes are both inefficient and of limited value. And this is not changing for the better. And let me show you some data from Gartner. This is drawn from a recent set of interviews they did with HR executives as well as employees, as users, right, of HR, of performance management processes. And this data shows that a vast majority of HR leaders, people are probably not terribly keen to dislike a process that they control, right? That when people lots of them admit that performance management is not achieving its goals or it's evolving fast enough, there's a problem, right? And these are some representative quotes from the study. Again, pretty damning stuff, right? A potpourri of nothingness. Or like, what if we just didn't have performance management? Would anything change? And these are HR people. Now, in fairness to HR, the lack of progress isn't for lack of trying. A lot of organizations have been experimenting with a variety of changes, removing performance training, moving from a yearly to a more frequent feedback cycle. Yet the impact of these reforms is uncertain at best. And a clue for what might be behind this lack of progress is the fact that changes have mostly been focused on reducing friction, right? Making the performance review easier and less time consuming, is certainly a help, but it doesn't solve the root cause of the dysfunction, which I would argue has to do with the fact that performance management is almost entirely based on the judgment of your boss, right? And I don't have time here to unpack all the biases and distortions that come from this, but there are several, and it's a problem because boss-driven performance reviews remain the dominant form of organizational life. In this Gartner survey that I mentioned earlier, 99% of the employees polled said that their performance is evaluated by their direct superior, and only 70% claim that teams had anything to do with evaluation. So in our book, we highlight a number of ways you can rethink the performance management approach. And I'm just gonna not unpack them here in the interest of time, but you can get a gist of it. I mean, the point is you got to diversify the inputs, and whether it's peers or customers or a combination. That's really the way to go. You just cannot rely on the hierarchy to make performance management decision. And these are the kinds of ideas that I think HR should be at the lead of. Rethinking very radically these practices. So let me just close with some things that I think I would urge HR professionals to think about as they want to become an essential partner to the C-suite and an ally, right, of everyone in the organization who wants to make the work more human-centric. And 4 things. The first is that we just simply need to aim higher, right? HR, like many other functions, so HR is not alone in this, it suffers from what my colleague Gary Hamel calls ADD, managerial ADD, or ambition deficit disorder, right? We're just insufficiently bold in reimagining ways of leading, organizing, and structuring these processes. And HR professions really ask itself, what's our equivalent of the Human Genome Project, or to harness green energy. Like, how do we really reinvent ourselves and what we deliver to organizations, right? So that'll be number one. Number two is, start kind of changing the processes you control. So we talked about performance management. That's a target-rich environment, as they say. You could think about recruiting and staffing, planning, learning and development. There are so many areas where HR could really, would have a lot of scope in kind of, without asking for a lot of permission, to start changing things by itself. But by itself in terms of maybe being the impetus of it. But as Pat said earlier, you gotta, when you reinvent practices, you have to ask the users. Often we don't really, we tell them, we do run a pilot after 95% of the process is baked and try to maybe tweak the margins. No, we have to start with their feedback right from the beginning and really invite as many people in the organization who really care to reinvent it, to be part of the process of reinvention. And again, HR could be create the platform, the support for organizations, for employees who are, fashion themselves to be as kind of organizational activists, to play that kind of a role, right? And create lots and lots of ideas like the one I mentioned earlier, not just around one principle, but around a whole, like, you flood the zone with ideas of all kinds, and you want to generate hundreds of these and then test them in a kind of experimental way. And again, I'll talk about this in my masterclass tomorrow. And then the last one is really to think of yourself as advocates of, what I call Team Human in the C-suite. So not so much like, the compliance people, but rather those who are after maximization of human potential. And this requires a different conception of the relationship between individuals and the organization. So in a bureaucracy, in most organizations, there's an instrumental kind of view of people, right? And it's not a coincidence we call them resources, human resources, right? So institutions, pay people, right? Individuals, they use people to generate income. The vision we have is organizations where the relationship is flipped, where it's individuals who harness the organization. It's their platform, right, to better their lives and the lives of those they serve for impact for themselves and more broadly. And it sounds maybe like funny wordplay, but I have to say the implications of kind of adopting this stance are pretty fundamental. And I think HR would do well by internalizing this and maybe advocating this kind of outlook on the relationship between people and work throughout the organization. So with that, I'll leave it and hand it back to Toby. And I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Michele, thank you so much. Again, I mean, when I think about the title of this 90-minute elective track, it's on reinventing the organization. And I think you took us right back to the sort of core message behind those three words, reinventing the organization. For me, I love, and there's lots in there, but I loved your hierarchy that you pulled up, your pyramid hierarchy, and quizzing that common take on obedience and saying, hang on a minute, there's tiers at the top here: initiative, imagination, daring. And I could see strands then coming through, not only at the sort of individual micro level, but when you then started talking about Hire and Bertzorg, you could see that then living in the organization itself. And that was really inspirational. I think it actually makes it much more tangible. So I thank you for that. So I'm going to ask Pat and Victoria to come join us because we're going to move now straight into our discussion panel. For those of you in our audience who were not here at the very beginning, you will have heard Michele Zanini, the author of Humanocracy, just now. So Michele was talking with us. We also have Pat Caldwell, who's joined us again, the COO at FundApps. And we are really pleased now to have Victoria Bradford join us as well, the head of people ops at Funding Circle. So that's a way of doing a quick intro for all of us. And actually, Victoria, having not yet heard from you, I'm going to come to you first. And here we are on this discussion panel, taking that reinventing the organization into a question one level below. So with that, there needs to be some kind of leadership revolution. Why do we need to radically rethink leadership and management in the new norm? Why is that important? Now, that's a big question. So let's double click one level below to kick us off. And actually, Victoria, I'm going to go to you first and ask, in the context of kind of radically challenging the norm, what does leadership actually mean in a modern organization? What does good look like?
Definitely. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thanks to Hi Bob. So I think what I'm going to talk about is just this concept of lazy leadership and lazy management. I know that's quite a strong term to use, and I think we were seeing a shift, towards this not being an acceptable way to lead pre-pandemic anyway. But the pandemic has obviously sped everything up in this new normal, future of work, etc., etc. And we're at a point now where the old sort of leadership tactics of leading by fear in that hierarchy of power that you've got in a corporate environment just doesn't work anymore. Lazy leadership relies on building rapport through social interaction, so be it in the coffee queue or at the water cooler or in the pub after work. And if you're not seeing your employees on a day-to-day basis, you can't rely on that anymore. You've got to be carving out time and actually having a conversation human to human with your employees to find out who they are. And I think that as well really links into this whole concept of performance review. So I was taking some notes while you were talking about that, Michele, because I think, again, we get to this point where managers particularly can feel that come the end of the year, actually, yeah, I can just tell this person how they've done. I've caught up with them loads of times in the office. We're always having a chat when we're getting our lunch. But actually, now that you're not seeing them every day, when you have a one-to-one with them, it's a precious time. And you need to be using that time to have those conversations and to learn how to manage performance without seeing someone chained to their desk. This whole 9 to 6, if you work for Funding Circle, 9 to 5, perhaps if you work elsewhere, concept has shifted. And yes, we talk about all these benefits that, I don't know, are a little bit dubious, like you can put your washing on at lunch and you can go to the gym or whatever. But actually, I would challenge managers and leaders to use this to harness their management ability and be like, okay, the ways that I've been assessing performance in my business function or in my team, whatever it might be, does that work now that I can't actually walk through the office and see who is still there at 6:30 and you get a gold star because you're still sat at your desk? So that was a bit of a long answer, Toby, sorry. But I just think that this whole lazy leadership thing is going to come unraveled. And those who are true leaders, who truly believe in people and trust their people to do good jobs, will get that trust in return. And subsequently, those who don't operate in that way perhaps might not be so successful in this new normal.
It's almost like you're saying, you've got to invest in having those deeper level connections, because the tokenism that you're categorizing under lazy leadership just won't cut it anymore. I'm interested to hear from you, Pat, with this idea of lazy, when you think about your organization, can you think of examples of that? Like, did that lazy leadership trigger anything with you?
I think my grin while Victoria was explaining that might have given it away, but yeah, it's obviously, it's a harsh, but I think relevant way of putting it. I think the piece we might have, if I look at our growth journey over the last 4 years, we get this concept called an accidental leader. And as teams grow out, I mean, we must have seen this within Funding Circle as well. As teams grow out, you end up with, you might get 8 developers on a team. And then you realize then that that's too much scope for this, idea of a manager. And so you promote your best developer. And they go into this team leadership position and then fundamentally realize, like the first time I stepped into a leadership position, that we haven't got a clue what we're doing. And we're making it up as we go. And I think that actually encourages the lazy leadership. I'm not sure we've ever stepped back and truly said, what is the leadership that's actually needed within this team and within this company? How do we actually assess someone's skills to be able to do that? And just because somebody might be the best person on the floor in a manufacturing plant, the best person on a mine site, the best developer in a team, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be successful in that role. So I think we've created lazy leaders, and I can take some accountability for that as a mostly former HR person. Is that I think we created the problem, and now we just need to call it out and fix it.
And I think that's a good, sorry, Toby, just to jump in on that point, but I think that's a really good point as well about being scared of fixing problems. I don't think that's necessarily an HR problem to solve. I think that's HR in collaboration with other business leaders, but actually where you identify that you've got an unnecessary layer of middle management, or you've just got a management layer that doesn't work, not being afraid of pulling that rug out. Things aren't going to fall over. It's going to be okay. And actually you might be in a position where you're far more productive, and you've got happier employees, and the output is greater. Yeah.
I love that. Michele, you showed that org structure with the 2 directors and the 900 people and the coaches and everything. The funny thing is that when we think of leader, we automatically assume that those 2 directors are the leaders. But in actual practices, in terms of who's inspiring work to be done, who might be making decisions, who's leading that communication interface, there's probably, I'm just going to take a guess, 50 of those 900 people demonstrating leadership. We just don't call them leaders, and maybe we need to redefine some of that as well.
Yeah, it's such an important point, Pat. I mean, and by the way, those are 900 teams, so 16,000 people.
Wow.
And the teams don't really have a leader, so it's more than that. But you're absolutely right, because I am sure if our audience, if I asked you, when I say executive team, who do you think about? You probably think about the C-suite, right? Who are, you could argue, I mean, if the definition of leadership is like making amazing things happen and catalyzing positive change in an organization, I'm not sure all those people are leaders in that way, and they're often not a team, right? So you know, we've in a way, like I wish we could come up with a different term than leadership, because it's been kind of compromised to and conflated with management and positional authority. And as you say, Pat, like, you know, sometimes the people that have the most power, the most influence, the most positive impact in your organization, you know, that is not correlated to where you sit on the hierarchy. And I think HR is a little bit complicit in perpetuating this kind of like misconception, because we have high potential programs and leadership development programs and whatever, and everything is like tiered by rung of the ladder. I mean, I'll just give you one quick example. I was just looking at the curriculum of a learning and development company that does L&D for companies across all levels, from individual contributors to the executive. So there are courses around thinking strategically, and then and other courses, and then they map, like, for whom is this course relevant, and it was not relevant. It was relevant for the the EVPs, the SVPs, whatever. But then further down the organization, it wasn't indicated to be a relevant course. So what you're telling most of the people in the organization is, like, you shouldn't think strategically, which is nuts, right? So anyway, I'll just get off. I'll get off the soapbox. But I do think that expanding the definition of what a leader is, and really fighting against the tendency that we have of conflating that with hierarchy. And it's not, as you say, Pat, it's not that we don't want hierarchy. The question is, how is a hierarchy built? And to whom is that hierarchy accountable, right? Is it accountable to the led, or is it accountable to the person that appointed you? And I think we can reimagine that as well. Anyway, I'll stop.
As you talk, I mean, I think some of this, I'd love for us to be able to rip up the use of common terms, but I feel like to say that we will just eradicate the term leadership from organizations, at least overnight, is going to be tough. So let me say that you can't do that. That can't be an answer. So I'm going to say leadership has to stay in as a term, but instead we need to expect more from them. And actually, Michele, you gave in your presentation, you gave us some tangible examples around what HR leaders specifically can do. And you went on to give another example. Then I'm going to go back to Victoria. You are one of our HR leaders on this call. I know, Pat, you have been, but I'm going to go by Victoria's current role. So, when you think about your own role, Victoria, and perhaps what you could be doing differently day to day as an HR leader to really help bring about a readiness for a new version of the world of work, what are some of the things that are preoccupying you? What are some of the things you wish you were doing?
Good question. I think some of the things we are doing, but could have more focus on and would like to see as more of a norm, is promoting is the wrong word. Promoting the brand of people in the business who aren't your stereotypical leaders. So to your point, yes, we have hierarchy. It might not be ideal. We're not going to remove it because we've agreed that as a start of this conversation. But for those at the top of the pre-established hierarchy, to be giving a platform to those who are leaders, be it in the area they work in, or they are thought leaders in the business, or they are the most creative, whatever it might be. So they are standing alongside them in front of the rest of the employee population, or in front of the market. And then you get to a point where it becomes the norm for actually, you might have your leader as a CEO, but you might also accept that this individual contributor who designed a new product or conceptualized a new product is also a leader within our company. And that really inspires those as well who frankly don't want to do people management, because yes, to get to the top of that ladder, you do typically, stereotypically, you have to be, oh, I'm a team lead, now I'm a manager, now I'm a head of, now I'm director, now I'm CEO, whatever. That doesn't suit everyone. And we know that's well established. I don't need to go into that. But just doing that would really make a difference. And I think that requires some vulnerability from the leaders that we typically have, and not necessarily at Funding Circle, not necessarily at FundApps, not necessarily at HiBob, but just across the industry. That takes vulnerability for people who are perhaps very well established in their careers, started their career wearing a suit and tie. You need to go to this university, and then you need to do this, and you need to do this, you need to earn your stripes. But for them to actually fast track people in their stripes, I think is the best way for that to happen.
You're twigging memories from Pat's case study earlier on when you were talking about some of the discomfort around this, Pat. I'd love you to build on this a little bit. I mean, you told us that sometimes we can't just rely on past experience, and sometimes this is uncomfortable. So yeah, just what's your reaction to that? What do you think HR should be expecting of itself in this?
I was nodding again, Victoria. Maybe it is the inner HR person coming out thinking that resonates really strongly there. I think it's an interesting kind of predicament that we're in, because I love that piece around vulnerability. If I look at my career, I've probably spent a decent chunk of my career contributing to this problem. That is the nature of it, because I think as humans, we're very, very almost taught and built to not want to say things like, I don't know, or maybe someone else has a different answer to this. And then we lean back on our own experience to work out, okay, well, I've seen this happen before, therefore I can replicate it again, use a bit of innovation or creativity or insert other buzzword here and hopefully make for a different outcome. And the reality is that the challenges that we're facing are going to require a different type of leadership, a non-lazy leadership, a non-ADD manager to be able to solve these kind of things. I always take that hybrid work as the perfect example. Just how many companies have defaulted back to a 1% incremental improvement on 2019 flexible work practices, when we just saw probably 30 years of evolution in hybrid work, if the pandemic hadn't happened, all be condensed within a little 18-month period. And we have to change that lens. I think it's not just a HR thing. HR can be blamed for lots of stuff simply because it's a people item. I think it's fundamentally a business item. It's fundamentally around designing work rather than roles. And when you put all them together, we're going to have to refresh how we approach leadership, how we approach work, and not just lean on a leadership team whose narrow tunnel vision is always going to influence the outcome.
I'm going to ask a question that builds on this idea of the sort of future of work, and something that you gave us the example of hybrid working again there, Pat. And I think you guys would relate to the fact that very often the future of work / the new normal and hybrid working are sort of almost used in the same breath, and almost there's a full stop at that point. And actually, we have heard some examples already from this panel that there is more to the future of work than that. And as a next question, I'd love to unpack that with you all now. And Michele, let's go back to you. I mean, not least because you've already started to share quite a few examples, and I'd like to go a bit deeper on this. What does this actually mean, the new normal or the future of work? It's got to mean more than just hybrid. Like, what else is out there?
It better. Just because you can do calls like these in your pajamas, or as Victoria said, you can load the dishwasher between calls. I mean, okay, that's improvement. But again, back to this ADD, like, the challenges we have as a society, we face amazing challenges and opportunities. We just need to, that's not, you can mobilize a little bit of a commitment from people by giving them a little bit more flexibility that way. But that to me is like such a low bar. We deserve better. We need to aim higher. So, I think, and I am a little bit frustrated that all the attention around the future of work is often reduced to this modality shift, which again, I don't want to be dismissive of it. It's significant. If you don't have to commute, if you can be at home, it's an advantage for sure. But again, first, it only applies to a fairly small, significant, but small sample of the population. So like, you're not thinking about everybody else, like, you know, the 80% that has to show up at work because you can't be in a grocery store via Zoom, right? And attend to the customer. And second, you know, I think there are, you know, what needs to be done to really free people at work is create that that sense of ownership, which means giving people autonomy and discretion, but at the same time, it also means giving them the tools so that they can exercise that autonomy responsibly, the information so that they can do that in an intelligent way. And, you know, I mean, we talked about hierarchy being inevitable, and to some extent, it is of a certain kind. I mean, some people are just going to have, if for anything, going to have more say than other people. But again, I'll go back to this point. Like, to me, the fact that you have Hire with 84,000 people and Bertha with 16,000, and then there's one company that I've just recently written an article about called Vikusville, that are a Russian retailer, $2 billion company, 20,000 people, food retailer, 2 layers. So one needs to explain to me, like the owner should be on those who want 7, 8 layers, to tell me why they need 7 or 8 layers, because it's obvious you can do it without, right? So I would almost like say, you know, say the default is these kinds of organizations that have shown a future that works, and you have to explain to me why we can't do that. And so kind of put the onus on those who want to keep the status quo, and really challenge and hold their feet to the fire so that they can think a little bit more expansively about what could be.
Pat, what's that triggered for you?
So pre-joining the tech industry, you picked up the Australian accent probably. The first half of my career was in the Australian coal mining industry, so obviously worlds apart in terms of how work gets done and how teams are structured. And most people probably haven't been on a coal mine, but you have a production department, a maintenance department, an engineering department, a processing plant department, support functions, HR, safety, and everything like that. And obviously this booming, let's bring tech innovation to something that's historically, you know, heavy industry. And we're asking to, I think I was smiling during that, because this concept of, we're asking managers, I'll use the term managers kind of loosely here, but we're asking functional managers who have a small remit to innovate and find a better way of working. But the reality is their innovation will always be limited to the tiny little functional remit that they actually have. And as that mine is built, or as production processes are sorted, it's because we've built org structures and then aligned work to it, instead of building work and trying to align roles to it and how you package them. And I was giving you a good grin, Michele, during that, because I was taking this concept of a 3,500 person mine site that has probably 6 or 7 layers once you get down to frontline supervisors, and saying, okay, well, let's say we went in and took out everyone that was not on the front line of the coalface, pun intended, was not on the coalface of everything that happened there, and simply said that they need to self-organize. Obviously, there's probably a deeply philosophical bit around what will break really quickly in that case. But what would innovation look like if we removed the tunnel vision that small remit functional managers have? And coming back, Victoria, to your point around vulnerability, sometimes the answer to innovation is that, hey, my role may not be needed. Or maybe my role doesn't deliver value beyond my own sense of pride or ego. And maybe that's not such a bad thing, but that's hard. That's a pretty hard human response to get out of people.
Something in that, Pat, there's a very personal reaction to that around how do we know if we're kind of getting this right? And I suppose if I think about that question a little bit differently, this isn't binary, it's a journey, of course. And I think what we've heard in some of the stories today is just how much that journey needs to rumble on in order to really kind of continue to push the bar forwards. But little by little, we must be able to find out if we're kind of moving in the right direction. And I guess that's one thing I'd love to just round off by asking you. And I'd go to you first, actually, Victoria, on this one. I mean, how do you know, how do you measure if you're actually taking steps in the right direction to rethink the organization, to rethink leadership? What do you use day to day to know if you're making the right steps?
It's a big question. I think there's two halves to it. There is obviously, you know, all the people data that the HR teams love to talk about and use great systems for. So be it from attrition and reasons that people are leaving, whether people are coming back from family leave, parental leave, your DE&I stats. There's all of that. But I think there is also, and please feel free to contradict me on this, but I think there is this. We can measure through sentiment to a certain extent. So we've all heard about the Great Resignation, which obviously we've touched on as well. And a lot of us have heard of that through our professions, but obviously also through Instagram and through social media and just through what is fashionable to talk about right now. And right now, the fashionable thing to talk about is the fact that everyone wants a new job because they're being chained back to the office. So I think when we get to a point where it is the norm, when you are with your friends on a Saturday night having dinner and you talk about this new leader in your business who perhaps doesn't look the way that a leader used to look or doesn't act in the way that a leader used to act, we've then got to a point of a societal shift. And I think that is what it takes. And that goes back to Pat's point about parental leave. Like, it's amazing that FundApps are doing things like that, but actually there needs to be a governmental change on this thing, then a societal change and a change in the way that we view the role of you know, gendered roles in parenthood. And that relates to the world of work as well, and just this ingrained image of what does a leadership team sat around a table look like. Once we get to a point where that shifts, I know that is very hard to measure, and I'm talking very like pie in the sky, but that's what I believe, yeah.
Okay, Victoria, you've given us quite an inspirational image, I think, there around a kind of future state of more than just the world of work. And I regret having to do this because I wish we could carry on talking about these and a bunch of other questions for many more minutes, but our time is up. So all I can do now is offer a huge thanks to Michele, to Pat, to Victoria for coming and joining this panel, for sharing your case studies and your book, Michele. What a fascinating and also vital set of topics. And let's just hope that these remain the kind of conversations that we're having as HR leaders going forward, rather than the timeframes of our next performance review. So thank you all very, very much. And it's now my final pleasure to introduce one new face, and that is Will. Will is joining us from our team here at HiBob. He's a seasoned sales engineer with us, and he's going to run a quick demo of our HRIS platform, Bob. So Will, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you very much. Just checking you can hear me, Toby, and everybody else.
I can hear you.
As Toby said, I'm going to spend just 5 minutes. That's all I have today. I could talk about Bob for 5 hours, so please bear with me when I'm only talking for 5 minutes. And the two topics that I want to cover today are engagement and how Bob can enable engagement within your organization. And then number two, globalization within this modern world, within this modern platform that we find ourselves in now with remote working and hybrid work and all the topics we've talked about today. So really crucial for me today is to talk around why engagement is important and how Bob enables that. So in terms of engagement, we want to ensure within Bob that the messaging that you are getting within the platform is very specific to you. This is crucial specifically for new joiners, new employees, even seasoned veteran employees. And this is where the Bob homepage is really going to come into its own, which is going to allow you to post shout outs, create polls, give kudos to your employees to really gain that engagement and that buzz around the organization. Making it specific to sites, maybe. If you're a global organization, you can do this across different geographies. But maybe if you're a smaller organization and you're in the UK and you want to go different sites as well, and you want to go just different sites in the UK, you can tailor that messaging as well. So what that means for you is I now don't have a Facebook wall of all the friends I used to have and no longer talk to, but I now actually have a wall full of the most relevant information for me. And it's going to make me engaged. We know the classic HR tools that we've used in the past. We see it once, we realize it's not relevant, it's not for me, I'm not engaged. I never use it again. I use it to book time off every now and again when I go on my 1 week summer holiday that I can get. And then after that, I never use it again. So it's really key to ensure engagement as well. Now, on top of engagement and where Bob really feeds into the ecosystem is around globalization as well. So enabling your global workforce, or localization as well. So I should really put global and localization here. Now, specifically today, I want to talk about two actual key key articles and some key facts. So both of which are from HR Onboard. I would recommend, if you haven't look on their site. It provides them incredible stats around onboarding specifically. And the two that I want to touch on is, if an employee has a successful onboarding, they are 82% more likely to stay at that organization. And the second stat is, if someone, or 6 out of 10 managers believe and have seen employees leave within their probation period from a poor onboarding. And that for me just really drives home how important onboarding, and where we then link onboarding to globalization, is absolutely critical. So what I'm showing you here is the start of a Bob-boarding process where you can onboard your new employees. But what's crucial here is ensuring that, number one, it's again specific. You are engaging. You can have different onboarding flows for your different organizations, your different sites, your different types of employees, which means for me, if I'm in the UK, I'm going to give you national insurance number as part of my onboarding flow. And if I'm in the US, I'm going to request social security number. And I don't want you to just think it's just about capturing certain data types. It can be everything from what it feels like from a departmental perspective. You saw there I had a little video, 3 minutes of welcoming you to Bob. But it might be, if it's a specific department onboarding, your department head is greeting you to the team. Whereas it might be for a senior executive job, and you have a complete different set of onboarding for a senior exec, because it's a different pitch and it's a different introduction to that team as well. And that, for me, those two stats around onboarding is why onboarding and globalization is critical, to ensure that you are moving around your different organizations, your different geographies, ensuring that it's meaningful. Nobody wants a standard onboarding for everybody, all 500 people that walk through the door. And Bob is going to enable you to do that. So then when the employee does start, they're engaged straight into the platform for that homepage, which I've just shown you as well. And it's going to enable them to really, really feel like they're engaged with the platform and actually get some additional value from that. That was Bob in 5 minutes. I don't know, Toby, if there's any kind of conversation you want to have off the back of that, but that's me for 5.
Well, thank you very much, Will. And actually, I think what I would say for anybody who is very keen to then go and learn more about Bob, we've got Axel, Jedson and Alex, who are colleagues of both myself and Will, in HiBob's virtual booth. They're there for further conversation. They've got some more videos they can show you. I think there's some kind of Amazon voucher incentive prize or something, if what Will was saying isn't enough to entice you in. And I can also attest, being only 60 days into my own journey at HiBob, that that Bob-enabled onboarding is really a game changer. I felt very connected to our global team, thanks to the platform-enabled components. Thanks so much, Will, for coming and joining us at the end there. And a final thank you to our panelists for taking part again today. And last of all, to all of you who have attended. And it's been fantastic to see the chat coming through as you've engaged in the different topics. So I really wish you all a fantastic next couple of days at the HR Congress World Summit, and really hope that you all take away many new learnings and that this session's contributed to that. Thank you very much, everybody.